Flying into India, if you've never been anywhere that wasn't even a little Greco-Roman, is like hovering over an alien planet. The buildings look like crushed cereal boxes dropped into a dusty pile, irregular rectangles standing upright sideways and sometimes laying flat on their backs. As the ground comes into focus, there's a rare sense of accomplishment and perhaps a little guilt. Here I am in India, you think, and that in and of itself is quite something. But you can't help imagining yourself in a red jacket wearing a pith helmet. It's much worse for the Brits. This particular land has never been among our possessions, but still you're thinking of the old Monty Python sketch. A tiger in Africa?
A tiger in Africa? A tiger in Africa? It's probably escaped from a zoo.
The airport in New Delhi is clean and modern, and of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? For a people that prides itself on a certain native toughness and can-do spirit, we are oddly terrified of every place else. New Yorkers of the rest of America, Americans of New York, and both of the rest of the world. More than one person helpfully urged me not to die when I told them where I was going. But when you get there, it's just an airport where you go through customs and get in a cab, just like any place else. On the way, you will notice the smell, and it's a smell that pervades all of Rajasthan. Although I found later that it is absent in the old Portuguese colony of Goa, not because of the long-departed Portuguese, but because of the absence of free-roaming cows and dogs. The Catholic converts the Portuguese left behind do not revere the lower life forms in quite the same way, not seeing them as souls on their way to becoming human, or as humans fallen from grace and trying to find their way back with good dogginess. Mixed with the sour smell of dried urine and baked feces is a thick stew of exhaust fumes. Indian cities are trucks and scooters and motorcycles and cars and rickshaws and bicycles and pedestrians going 24 hours a day in a moment-to-moment fight for primacy and purchase without any apparent organizing principle beyond the laws of nature. From above, it wouldn't look very much different from cells in a petri dish, meeting, scattering, colliding, according to the most basic principles of biological impulse and Newtonian physics. If there's a code of written law governing it all, it's either ignored or invisible to the outsider. It feels a little like a demonstration of faith. Faith that there is a merciful deity whose guiding hand ensures that it will all come out all right. And for the most part it does, which you have to admit borders on the miraculous and may indeed be potent evidence of the divine. Not knowing the country, the language, or the culture, and having a head full of all the worst stories I've ever heard about robbery, rape, murder, immolation, and snakes, I booked with a tour group for the Rajasthan leg of the trip, planning to strike out for Goa on my own once I had become acclimated. On the first night, we went out for an introductory dinner with our guide Bhupesh, a native Indian descended from Asian peoples who had migrated centuries ago into the eastern province of Bengal. He had grown up poor, but he was well educated at a private school only because his father took a job as a janitor there, specifically so that he and his brother could attend for free. This was why he spoke fluent English, which, as I discovered, is not common among Indians in spite of the long British occupation. Only the upper classes and the occasional street hustler, some of them children, speak English. The Indians we meet in America are very often upper class back home, even as they devote themselves to menial work or difficult businesses in the West. If you take the time to talk to your Pakistani or Indian Uber driver, you'll find they're very often professionals with advanced degrees who've chosen to drive a cab so that their children can live well. After dinner, I wandered the streets where rival packs of stray dogs were barking at each other in what seemed more like a nightly ritual than a turf war. They'd run back and forth through the alleys for a while before settling in for a nap on the narrow strip of separation from the street proper that passed for a sidewalk. I felt like I'd broken out of prison, and I almost expected the hard drop of a heavy hand on my shoulder come to drag me back to my native land, where the strays are properly vicious and terrified. Up before the sunrise, we stacked our bags in the hotel lobby, then trudged our way to the train station. This was the first time I experienced the dual consciousness that would plague me throughout the trip. It was particularly acute at these moments when we were in transit and on the move. Who are you now? Are you the cool adventurer living out of a backpack, open and curious about other cultures? Or are you the ugly Westerner, come to pay the people your forebears impoverished for the privilege of gawking at what remains? It's a question I never resolved, and one that bothered me enough to torture the tour group with it in passive-aggressive ways until I had an epiphany in a place called Abaneri. Good a place as any, I guess, but we'll get to that. The main hall of the station was dominated by an enormous mural of Gandhi, whose image pervades the country with his statue presiding over town squares from one end to the other, and figurines in his likeness sold in every tourist trap. There were hundreds of Indians camped out on the floors waiting for their train. If you tried that at Grand Central, it would only take about 5 minutes before some functionary came along to say, "I'm sorry, but you can't do that here." Home of the free my ass. The network of rail that crisscrosses India was built by the British, or the Raj as the colonial government is usually known, and the trains themselves go back to the 40s. I asked Bhupesh if people were going to ride on top as I had seen in old Merchant Ivory movies. No, he said, they don't do that anymore. The group was made up entirely of subjects of the crown, except for a cherub-cheeked Dutch couple that you'd peg immediately as the first victims if you saw them in a horror movie about Western tourists in Asia. The rest were from the mother country and its satellites, England, Australia, New Zealand. Everywhere they went, they namaste'd and pressed their hands together and bowed. Not having Hollywood to make their apologies for them, they have to do it themselves. Then again, if we had left enough of our misnamed Indians alive and with intact cultures to constitute a distinct and independent nation state, I'm sure there'd be a bunch of Americans running around the hotels and gift shops, solemnly holding their hands up and saying "how" between sessions in the sweat lodge. The train arrived looking like a museum exhibit that had been pressed into service in a pinch. It moved through the station like a ghost ship, out of its time but still sailing. When it came to a stop, Bhupesh hustled us quickly to our shared berth, where I made my first acquaintance with the Asian preference for sleeping surfaces that aren't much softer than a hard floor. I was assigned a top bunk, which I was terrified of climbing in and out of when the train was moving until I got the hang of it. As we pulled out of the station, we all settled down on the bottom for the 16-hour ride to the desert and the ancient sandcastle town of Jaisalmer.